Bună ziua tuturor și bine ne-am regăsit la a treia ediție a LibFest, unde continuăm dialogurile cu autori de bestselleruri îndrăgite în toată lumea. Sunt Monica Grecu, redactor coordonator al colecției Blue Moon de la Editura Litera și îmi face o deosebită plăcere să o am ca invitată astăzi pe scriitoarea americană de origine română, Roxanne Veletzos. Dintre romanele ei, două, și anume Fetița pe care au lăsat-o în urmă și Vara, noastră, de demult, au fost publicate în limba română de Editura Litera. So, Roxana, we are so happy to have you here with us, talking to the Romanian audience. We are going to speak in English. My first question to you is, what were the main literary influences in your youth?
My goodness. I started reading from a very early age. I fell in love with it, probably from first or second grade. And my parents were avid readers as well. And so our house was always filled with books. I have to say, probably the earliest influence in my life was a Romanian author, a very well-known Romanian author, Ionel Teodoreanu. I fell in love with I believe it was a trilogy, La Medeleni. I also loved I think it was his first novel called Casa Bunicilor, which really resonated so much with my own youth and sort of what I experienced with my own grandparents and this bond, this closeness and in sort of this more or less an idyllic time. I also loved Balzac. I loved Alexandre Dumas. I think I read The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo numerous times. And finally, Agatha Christie. This was perhaps a little later in my life, around the age of 12, right around the time that we left Romania. An aunt of mine actually had her entire collection translated in Romanian. So I really fell in love with these books and actually had a chance to read them in Romanian. Those are some of my early influences.
How has your literary taste changed in time? And do you have reading recommendations for various age groups, like, I don't know, preteens, teens, young adults? How do we form a literary taste?
I think as readers, our tastes probably change all the time. Since I published my first book, which takes place in Romania, as you know, beginning in 1941 and spans through the years of communism and Soviet influence in Romania. Since then, I've sort of leaned much more towards historical fiction. My second novel is also a work of historical fiction, and so as a writer of historical fiction, we obviously read a great deal in that genre. As far as recommendations, quickly, in that genre, I love Kate Quinn, I love Armando Correa, I love Julian Cantor, Kristen Harmel, and I think these are some of the authors whose books have also been translated in Romanian and are probably available out there for readers. I also love, I have to say, Ruta Sepetys, who actually writes for young adult audiences. She actually just came out with a book, which takes place in Romania during the 1989 revolution. And I actually just read her book, and I found it, I literally read it in a day and kind of skipped meals and went to bed very late. It was just fascinating for obvious reasons to me as a Romanian, but really beautifully written. And in capturing the experience, the turbulence of that time, and yet also the hopefulness of the young people and their courageousness. So I highly recommend that book.
Thank you so much. Now going to your writing. What is your favorite spot for writing?
I write in my office. And so that's sort of like my Zen spot. I find that writing in the same place, having that consistency really helps with the flow of the writing. Although the one nice thing about being a writer is that you can write everywhere. So generally I'll take my laptop with me wherever I go. So if I'm on a trip visiting my sister, or sometimes I'll even go over to my mom's house, who lives only about 20 minutes away, and kind of spend the day with her and write there. But I do find that my true creative flow really comes when I'm in my usual spot, and sort of in keeping with the routine.
How important is documentation for the backbone of a book? And how long do you work on documentation? What is more rewarding for you as a writer, to create the world, the setup where the characters live, or to create the characters?
I think in the case of historical fiction, they're equally important. Everything I write is very character-based, or character-driven. And so I go to great lengths to really develop my characters, to sit with them for a long time, let them sort of evolve within me and grow with them, get to know them, so to speak, so that they can really come alive in the pages of the novel. That being said, equally important for historical fiction is research. And I do an extensive amount of research. I did it with both of my books. In the case of my first book, which takes place in Romania, I was obviously already familiar with some of the events that I write about through anecdotal information, the stories that my mother shared with me, stories that I'd even heard from my own grandparents living in Bucharest as a child. But at some point, I felt that I definitely needed to expand on that I needed more background information. And so at some point in the writing, I had to kind of go back, take a little bit of a break, and really, really immerse myself in history books to really learn about what happened with Romania during World War II, which was, for Romania in particular, such a complex situation. As you probably know, there were so many factions in play and things were moving so rapidly. And so I felt that it was really, really important to have a full grasp of that in order to be able to bring it to life, and also to simplify it in a way so that the focus of the story is on the characters' experiences, but yet to thread this background information as seamlessly as possible. Same thing with my second book. I spent really many, many months researching Hungarian history, also in World War II, as well as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Obviously, I was much less familiar with the history of this country, but even though my father's from Transylvania, which is the region, as you know, bordering Hungary, so I felt like I knew a little bit about the culture in general, but I really had to spend even more time really digging into the historical details. Sorry for the long answer. I mean, just to summarize it, I spend months researching before I start writing and while I'm writing as well.
So the long answers are actually what we're looking for, because they tell us more about you. So feel free to elaborate as much as you want. Going back to the characters, do they have a life of their own, or do you draw them clearly from the very beginning? So are you a puppeteer, or do they live?
I'm a little bit of both. I feel that I definitely have to start with a vision of who they are as characters. However, as I said, as I write and I get to know them and I spend so many hours every day in their company, I feel that they evolve. And sometimes they surprise me. I mean, they actually say writers say all the time that characters sometimes at one point in the writing process take a life of their own. And I think that is absolutely true. That was particularly the case with my second book, which is purely fictional. The true events are obviously based in real life, but the characters themselves are fictional. And I felt that, again, the more time I spent with them, the more they came to life for me, and sometimes surprised me in their actions. Sometimes I sort of had a preconceived notion of where I wanted to take the story, and getting to that stage in the story was like, well, this is not what Ava would do. It's just not what she would do. So I would have to kind of change gear and almost let them lead me in the direction in which they wanted to go. With my first book, it was a little bit different because the story itself is based on my own family's true life story. Anton and Despina in particular, in the first novel, my grandparents are very, very true to life. And so I really started knowing the characters. And so I was able to focus in that instance more on the plot line and their experiences of what they went through in this period of time in history, as opposed to fleshing out the characters.
So actually, my next question refers exactly to your first novel, The Girl They Left Behind. And you've already started talking about how it strikes a personal chord, because it talks about your family's experience, and also about Bucharest and life in communism and all those really fine lines, and it was all in all a very difficult time, and I think some of our readers remember living through that period. So could you expand a little bit on the family history?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is a true life story. My mother, much as my protagonist Natalia in the book, was abandoned in the middle of this wave of violence that had been unleashed by the Iron Guard in 1941. She was found on a doorstep of an apartment building on Dacia Boulevard. She was originally taken to the police station, eventually ended up at an orphanage where she was adopted by my grandparents, Anton and Despina. And, throughout the years, she really tried to find something about the fate of her biological family. Unfortunately, in the years of communism, tens of thousands of documents pertaining to that time period, and especially the Bucharest pogrom, were destroyed. And even here in the United States, after we moved here, she tried through various organizations to find out some information, and all of her efforts were really fruitless. So it was really in this sort of mystery that shrouded her biological parents that the seed for this novel was planted. Because as you might imagine, I also became sort of, obsessed, or couldn't stop thinking, haunted by what might have happened to them. And so it was in the absence of answers to those questions that this story was really born.
Yeah, so it's sort of trying to find your roots and how you came to be, basically.
Yeah, and also I was extremely close with my grandparents growing up in Bucharest, and they really suffered so much in that time, as many other Romanian families did. And it was so important to me, equally important, to sort of really bring to light not only what their experience was like in that time, but really sort of what the Romanian experience was for so many families. How much they suffered and how they were sort of thrust into this environment in which they really felt lost for so many years. And really sort of also to highlight a little bit of Romanian history, which the world is really just now getting to know, or I should say, since the revolution. So that was equally important to me.
So apart from the historical Bucharest, let's say, so or Bucharest in the historical times of the novel, is there any part of your Bucharest reflected in the book? I don't know, your neighborhood, your the places you grew up in, interesting characters from your childhood.
Yeah, writing this book was so cathartic for me because it really allowed me to kind of revisit Bucharest. And I sort of grew up as a teenager, really sort of heartsick, missing my grandparents, missing the place where you're born. I think that never leaves you. That always is an important part of you. And so being able to write about Bucharest kind of gave me a chance to revisit it, As far as specific places, the house in which I grew up is actually no longer there. It was part of that huge demolition project, which took place in Bucharest when the big palace was built. So there isn't really a home for me to revisit, but some of the streets I certainly remember, Parcul Cismigiu in particular. I used to go there with my grandparents all the time, and I still vividly remember pieces of it. Sometimes I even dream about them. So yeah, there were pieces of my childhood in there, definitely.
Have you been back to Bucharest?
I've been back not in recent years, but I have been back twice since the revolution. The second time I actually stayed quite an extended period of time for about a couple of months. And I had actually hoped to take my family, my husband and my 2 sons there. And unfortunately, COVID happened. So in recent years, those plans sort of fell apart. But that is definitely a dream of mine, to be able to bring my family there as well and introduce them to my home city and the culture of Romania.
Yeah, that would be great. And perhaps we can also organize a meeting with our readers then, if you come.
Absolutely. I'd love that. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go a little bit to your second book, When the Summer Was Ours. And this story revolves around a forbidden love. And it's a story of guilt and redemption. And it starts in Hungary in the years, in the beginning of World War II, let's say, where it wasn't very clear what was going to happen. Yeah, for them. Then it reaches the depths of misery with the Nazi camps. And then it goes through the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, as you said. And then Budapest in the 80s and New York in the 60s and back and forth. And
it's rather epic. Yes, big knot.
So I have a question which is related to your voyage as a writer through history. How difficult was it to pinpoint the essential in each of these periods? How did you find the writing process?
The second book was in many ways more difficult than the first one to write, as I said, because I wasn't really as familiar with Hungarian history, and it involved a lot more research. I really wanted the characters to drive the story. And so I actually kind of did it in parts. I really immersed myself in their World War II history, where Eva and Alejandro meet on the brink of war, and sort of through their journey took them further in time, at which point, again, I would stop and resume research. And I felt that I had to do it in parts, otherwise it would have been overwhelming. And I also didn't want to be so focused on the history and the historical detail that it would overtake the story. So again, it was the characters kind of leading me and researching, like the research following in the background.
In your author's notes, you mentioned the Roma Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of stuck to my mind, the idea that it's not so much talked about.
Yeah.
And although some 100,000 of people died, they are still, not recognized, let's say. So what would you say should be done? How would you feel that this could be amended somehow?
I mean, my gosh, that's a very complex question, because I think of my job as a writer is really to inform. I think by becoming informed, by sort of, giving light or bringing these stories to light, is how we can all sort of re-educate ourselves, really see the perspectives of, portions of the population that perhaps we don't understand as well. We don't understand their experiences, but ultimately this is a way to sort of bring us all together if that makes any sense, but also to understand what that experience was like for that group of people, if that makes any sense.
Oh, absolutely. It does.
But again, I think my job is to, because that's what actually struck me originally, and it's really what drew me to the story. I actually came across this bit of information as I was researching my first novel, and it sort of like really struck a chord, and I filed it in some little corner of my mind thinking, this is something I want to look at more closely. And I think it was a seed already before I even really began exploring it. I think a large part of it was sort of this fascination that I always had with the Romani culture as a child in Romania. I fell in love with their music from a very early age. My family and I would go to Constanța every summer. We would stay in this house, and there was a little restaurant patio next door where they would play their music, and it just, I couldn't sleep at night, sort of just wanting to stay up and listen to their music. And I think that's sort of where that fascination with really began. And so there was also a bit of a personal connection to the second story as well.
For me, when I was translating it, it was very interesting. I always sort of plunge into the story when I translate, and sometimes I get carried away and then I come back but the thing is that I could almost listen to the music, the way you described it. And that was really interesting, because usually we say that books are sort of visual, in the sense that you could almost see the movie of the book as it was. But in this case, it was as if you could listen to the music as well. And it was very, very interesting to me.
Well, that's a huge compliment. So thank you very much. I really tried to do that. So I'm happy that I succeeded.
Okay, so what would your advice be for a budding writer?
Gosh, I don't give up. Writing is a profession that requires a lot of perseverance. It involves sometimes a lot of rejection. At least I can only speak about what the experience is like in the US. And it could be very discouraging, to sort of find the right publisher, the right agent, to kind of sometimes, you're going through this long process of writing and spending a lot of time really by yourself alone with these characters. And you have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to really not give up. I mean, you have to just be tenacious, and also read a lot, because I think to be a good writer, you really have to read all the time. So read, learn from other writers, see what they do, read in your own genre, so you can sort of see, what's topical, what's timely. Reading is huge for a writer. Yes.
Thank you. And now, of course, we are curious to see what your next book project is. So can you tell us a couple of words of...
It's a little early for me to talk about it in full detail, but it's another story set behind the Iron Curtain. I seem to gravitate to these types of stories in part of the world. And it sort of keeps in theme with my first two novels as well, which is, courage against tyranny and sacrifice for those that we love, and perseverance, really like the sort of, survival of the human spirit. And, but again, I hate to give any more away because it's sort of still in its formative stages, but more to follow soon.
Okay, we're looking forward to
Thank you.
to reading more of your work. Now, if you could please give a message to our Romanian readers, and you can do it in English or in Romanian as you feel more comfortable.
Oh my gosh, I have to literally rewire my brain to the other language. So I will do my best. Seeing my novels translated in Romania was really a dream come true. It's really so very special to me. And so I want to thank Litera, Editura Litera, for, really making that dream a reality and bringing my novels to Romanian readers. I just want to say that, I'm so honored to be able to share my books with readers in Romania, and I hope that they will really touch their hearts and they'll feel inspired by these stories that I was able to share in these books. So that's it.
Okay, so that's it from me, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
It was my pleasure. Mulțumesc foarte mult, Monica. Sunt fericită că am putea să aveam această ocazie.